What is the cloud? So if you pull up any of the generative AIs and ask that question, you get basically a result that looks very similar to this, right? So essentially, it's when you're going to consume any sort of IT service, data, outside of an environment that is directly under your control. That's essentially how they consider the cloud. I would say it's a little off because they do have the nomenclature we'll get into here a little bit about private cloud, which technically is kind of a cloud you're operating and running services out of. It's some nuancy, but again, that's kind of the definition we're going to use today to kind of define what is the cloud. And then, kind of how does it work, right? So again, as we mentioned, this is where you're not really paying per se for the overall platform that you're running on top of. And with the exception of private cloud, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But where you're consuming services and you're paying just for the service or component of that service you're consuming, that's really what we're talking about. Those are cloud. That's where you're really leveraging cloud componentry. So as I've mentioned, there's kind of really four major kind of components when we talk about cloud. First is your public cloud. And so this is your big hyper web scaler. So this is going to be Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure, right? We've probably all, at least at some level, heard of those big players in the public cloud space. And so anytime you're consuming services, maybe it's G Suite, maybe it's Amaro 365, right? You're technically on a public cloud service at that point. Now it's classified a little bit differently in terms of, we'll break that down a little bit in just the next slide here. But technically, that's a public cloud service you're consuming today. So whether you thought you were in the cloud or not, most of us probably already are in a limited fashion, right? And so this is one of the conversations we have a lot of times where people say, I don't want to go to the cloud. I don't trust the cloud. Well, are you running G Suite? Are you running Microsoft? You're already in the cloud. You've already made that direction and some of the dependencies come along with it. So let's continue to maybe talk a little bit more about why do we have this phobia about cloud, if that is the case, and how do we kind of work around those concerns and or educate around the capabilities. Private cloud, as I mentioned, this is one of the things that we've kind of really, since the introduction of um, the hyperconverged category, has really kind of become something where we can talk a little bit about private cloud and some of the technology that they brought into those stacks. And so the one we most commonly, I think you probably saw on the slide that Brian shared with us earlier, is going to be Nutanix running Acropolis Hypervisor, right? That is a scale out compute platform that allows us to virtualize and run a lot of the same service type capabilities that you get from these big web hyperscalers that we mentioned earlier in public cloud, but you can actually own the infrastructure and hardware in your own data center. In certain situations, you may need to have that. Maybe you've got on-prem manufacturing equipment. Maybe you've got data or latency requirements that you can't have that is tied to something on-prem that can't, due to the cloud latencies and the connectivities or speeds, we simply can't move it. So there's still a place today, and in some cases, it's a combination, right? And that's where we get into hybrid cloud. Maybe there's some things that have to remain on-prem and be in that kind of private cloud arena, but doesn't mean we can't still leverage the things that fit in public cloud and tie them together, right? We have to be very thoughtful and mindful about how are the users accessing the apps and data, where are they at, and how we get them as close as possible to minimize any changes in the user experience. So again, that's part of the strategy we're talking about a little bit more. And the final one, this is really kind of that, hey, if you're in an environment where you've determined you need full disaster recovery and you run a secondary data center site, and then you go to look to move to the cloud. Yes, cloud has multiple regions. You could put resources in Azure East and resources in Azure West, and you could fail back and forth between them. But if Microsoft has a catastrophic failure, which, let's be honest, if they do, we're all going to have a really bad day in IT no matter what happens. But if you were to instead of going to just Azure East, you went to AWS data center on the West Coast. Now you have agnosticity and you have resiliency across even the public cloud providers. And so that's where we get into looking at like multi-cloud. And you can do the same kind of thing from that perspective, but it allows us to have some resiliency across those public cloud providers where, again, you don't have a direct recourse in most cases to go back to them, but we can actually be fault tolerant across it. So the next part I kind of talked about and alluded to a little bit, we'll jump into is this cloud service models. So this is really how you concern cloud services. So as I mentioned earlier, most of us are probably at software as a service, the SaaS model, right? We've consumed most likely a G Suite or an O365, and that's how we're getting our email and our Office licensing or whatever it might be. And so that is a software as a service model. You're subscribing to a license and you're getting a service back in return. You have zero control of the infrastructure. You don't know where it runs. Honestly, you really don't care, right? That's the beauty of the software as a service. You get the service, it does what it needs to do, and you just pay for your usage of that service on some typically monthly or annual fee. Platform as a service is kind of taking that next step kind of back from a true software, but it's providing services like SQL as a service. So in that environment, you're running SQL instances that Microsoft is using their best practices to deploy redundant SQL instances, keep them patched and maintained, and then you're just simply installing your databases on top of them. So it takes that, maybe that underlying SQL infrastructure knowledge away, it being handled by Microsoft best practices in terms of patch security and updating. And all you have to worry about is just loading and maintaining your database. So that's an example of a PaaS service. They also have Active Directory as a service inside of Azure as well that can integrate with your Entra ID. So that's another kind of an example of some of those platforms and services that are out there. And then probably the model we're all most familiar with or kind of go akin back to is when the hyperscalers first came out. It was really infrastructure as a service, right? How do I take my VMware VM I have today, and how do I translate that into cloud? Well, I'm going to go get CPU. I'm going to get memory. I'm going to go get disk, and I'm going to deploy it in there as a resource on top of that hyperscaler platform. That's really infrastructure as a service. You're paying for the resources you're consuming in what they could call like a t-shirt size model, right? And so that's kind of what those three models really represent in terms of when we go into clouds. So now we kind of established cloud, some of the components and services. Let's jump into what are the benefits, right? So again, I'm here to tell you that if you're trying to save costs, you, in most cases, that's probably not going to be realistic unless you're going to go run down the cost of your air handling, cooling for your data center, your power, everything else. Like if you really want to do that, you could probably maybe find some savings. But again, the benefits of the cloud really come into flexibility and scalability, right? We can easily change configurations of resources on a VM on the fly and then pay for those resources as we use them. And then if we ratchet it back down, that cost goes away. Or if we, a lot of cases, when we have to come in and size those capital expenditures for net new infrastructure, we're having to plan that for 3 to 5 years, depending on the depreciation life cycle. And when we're going to have to do a refresh or update, when we go to do that, we have to assume what's in there today, what's some growth capacity. So you're paying for that out the gate. When you go to cloud, that model changes, right? Because now we can, on a dime, spin up what we need when we need it. And when we don't need it, we spin it back down and we're not paying for it. So that's where you can start to see some of the potential cost savings. DR and business continuity is probably one of the best and most widely used use cases from a cloud perspective. We can get the data into the cloud. We can recover it in the cloud. We have business continuity. We can fail between data centers or physical, again, Azure East, Azure West locations at relatively minimal cost compared to what it would cost us if we were trying to do that from a traditional on-prem infrastructure, having multiple data centers with infrastructure and hardware, replicating across each other, and then doing the checks and the services to go back and forth to maintain that. Remote accessibility, again, these data centers are everywhere, right? So we can access these services really from pretty much anywhere. And because of the investments the hyperscalers have made in terms of their access paths into their environments, no matter where you're at in the world, you can really get into these services. Now, again, latency is still a factor. I'm not going to negate that. But again, it just makes these things even more accessible to our workforce. Obviously, automatic updates. I want to touch on this one just for a minute because this is important. One of the things, and this is specifically with Microsoft Azure, is that if you are in a situation where you still have to run legacy operating systems, one of the unique things that Azure has done is the fact that you can run legacy operating systems with extended security updates inside of Azure at no additional cost. So if you have to run 2012 and there's an application you haven't been able to get transitioned or migrated off of yet since that went end of life last year, you have the opportunity using extended security updates natively in Azure. That's just provided. But if you still have on-prem services, we can deploy services in conjunction with Azure to manage your on-prem resources and provide extended security updates. So I know it's something I see quite a bit in the field when we're talking to customers and environments. So just be aware there's some things that you can do even today for your on-prem environment that leverage cloud that allow you to maybe extend that life to give you the time you need to refactor the application and move to whatever is next and get off of that legacy operating system. The other thing is this the scale of faster innovation. I mean, again, it's at the switch of a knob, we can be running something new tomorrow, or change. And, I've got some situations where maybe you want to go test a GPU delivered workload. I mean, in the day of AI that we're in and living in the day, GPUs are continuing to become more and more critical for different workloads and different things you might be looking at trying to accomplish. We could easily spin up a VM inside of these hyperscalers that has GPU attached to it, and then we can test or pilot whatever workload you might want to be doing from that perspective. So, while there's some good cases, there's also some things we need to be aware of. As we mentioned, there's some situations that just don't always align it to being in the cloud. So one of those is if you need absolute full control across the entire stack, you're probably not going to be going to the cloud, because there's a certain level when you go to cloud that the hyperscalers provide, even in a private cloud or like a colo or whatever else. And then from that point up, you have some responsibilities. High data ingress egress. So one of the things that we do get billed for is in and out speeds on the network. And so that can be, if there's a lot of chat or you're moving a lot of data back and forth between environments, this may be a cost prohibitor to moving to cloud. Regulatory requirements, right? Maybe you got a regulatory requirement that we just can't meet or can't facilitate in the cloud. Maybe a reason you have to stay or can't go to the cloud. That's where that private cloud conversation would come into play. Network connectivity, I've seen this a lot. Again, I'm in Iowa. There are a lot of rural communities here that we do work and serve. In some cases, again, they just don't have the internet circuits or bandwidth. So sometimes we have to simply look and say, okay, maybe this isn't a good fit because today the networking capabilities and bandwidth aren't there. So maybe it's a conversation we circle back to in 2 or 3 years and we can look and see, has the technology or the networking capabilities changed enough that we can come back and have that conversation? So those are the things that we're looking for that may be, not ideal. Not saying we can't work around some of those in certain situations, and we have, but those are things to watch out for as well that may be indicators that you may have a harder journey moving to cloud.